On November 1st, Variety published a feature article titled "Crisis at Marvel, Jonathan Major's Backup Plans, the Marvel Reshoots, Reviving Original Avengers and More Issues Revealed." We'll go through all of those in turn, but the significance of this article is that Hollywood now accepts it. Marvel is in crisis. That puts a new spin on the recently released book MCU, The Reign, past tense, of Marvel Studios. And that book is what we'll be exploring in this video. This video is sponsored by Ground News. October 10th saw the release of the book MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios by Joanna Robinson, Dave Gonzalez and Gavin Edwards. Since then, nuggets of information from it has fueled many articles, many YouTube videos and many Reddit posts, and we'll have some fun with them too, but as fun as they may be, those are just nuggets of information. What should be of far greater interest is how the MCU became the greatest, most universally beloved entertainment franchise in history worldwide, only to systematically dismantle all that success and make the audience goodwill wither away. How could it all unravel so fast?
Put a chick in it, make her gay!
You might think that's the answer, but if we are to believe this book, that had nothing to do with it, and the Marvels should be another crowd-pleasing smash hit.
You serious?
This book does in fact answer the question of what went wrong, but it doesn't make the answer explicit. On the contrary, rather than spelling out where Marvel went wrong, it goes to great lengths to obfuscate just that, instead trying to distract the reader and shift the blame elsewhere. Problem is, the truth will come out, which is what this video is all about, so strap in, because we're going on a deep dive. In this editorial, I will first break down how this book is trying to manipulate you and distract you from seeing what should be blatantly obvious. Then I'll go through Marvel's Rise, which the book is straightforward about, before breaking down what the authors are so desperately trying to obfuscate, namely the reasons behind the fall of the MCU. Sadly, this book isn't alone in obfuscating facts in favor of pushing a narrative. The news do it all the time, making it difficult to tell when you're seeing a fair and balanced description of reality and when a narrative is being pushed upon you. Luckily, there is a tool to find out, and that would be Ground News. Ground News is an app and website which helps you easily compare coverage and make sense of what's going on in the world. For every story, you get a quick visual breakdown of the news coverage, political bias, and so much more. To see how this works, let's look at the latest update in the case of Disney versus Florida over the Reedy Creek Special District. On October 31st, Bob Iger warned that if DeSantis wins lawsuit, others will be punished for disfavored views. Now, is that reality, or are Disney trying to spin a narrative? Let's look at the summary of the coverage. In the default center view, you get the summary of the story, but Ground News also gives you summaries of how left-leaning publications choose to cover this story and how right-leaning publications choose to cover it. And best of all, with their new comparison feature, you can see exactly how the coverage differs. These summaries are based on the 20 total outlets reporting on this story, and from the bias distribution, we can see that 50% of those were left-leaning, while 44% were center, and a mere 6% were right-leaning. Ground News also lets you compare each outlet's headline and summary, who owns the publication, and the bias distribution for each outlet. Also, Ground News has a Chrome extension that kicks in when you're browsing other news sites, informing you of where the publication sways and how the story is covered in other outlets. One of their most important features though is the blind spot feature, which specifically collects news items that are either undercovered or not covered at all by publications with left or right leanings respectively, meaning you might miss them from your regular newsfeed, and sometimes this is where you'll find the most important stories. You can even create your own newsfeed that focuses on specific locations or areas of interest. Now, Midnight's Edge viewers get 30% off the unlimited access plan using our link ground.news/midnights, also found in the description. By doing so, you're supporting us, as well as getting a great product for reliable sources. With that, let's stay on the topic of narrative versus real events, as we dive into the book MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios. First and foremost, this book is not officially the official story of the MCU as told by Marvel and approved by Disney, but unofficially it is very much so just that, as the narrative is very kind to those still standing, i.e. Kevin Feige and Bob Iger. They are the undisputed heroes of the narrative being presented. In the intro, the authors state that the book is based on interviews with 100 people who were there, as well as a slew of published articles and earlier books. Yet clearly, not all of that material has been given equal weight, and some sources, no matter how valid, have simply been left out, and the only reason I can imagine for omitting them is that what they reveal wouldn't fit the narrative being presented. That's the first of two ways this book is trying to manipulate you. Before we get into the second way, let's consider some examples of the first. For instance, a point is made that because of the mandate to pump out a never-ending stream of big-budget, high-profile MCU shows for Disney+, Kevin Feige was and is spread too thin, and so quality had to give way to quantity. And yes, the book does admit that the Marvel brand has taken a few dents. But this way, it absolves Feige for any wrongdoing. It wasn't his fault, he spread too thin. But then, who is to blame? Who mandated there had to be so many Marvel series on Disney Plus in the first place? Well, that would be Bob Iger, and we know this because he not only admitted it in his own book, The Ride of a Lifetime. At the time, he took great pride in it. But that was then. Now that we know his Disney Plus strategy was a monumental failure, this book merely glosses over it, treating the demand for more Disney Plus Marvel shows as a given, but without going into why, and certainly without assigning any blame to Bob Iger, because he is, alongside Kevin Feige, the hero of this narrative, and is also a visionary. The book explicitly tells us so in those exact words. You know who isn't a visionary though? Bob Chapek. He is one of the villains of the narrative, so rather than dwell on his very successful career, which included being the head of multiple divisions at Disney and leading them all to success, he is simply labeled as, and this is a direct quote, a pencil pusher who was promoted by mistake and who couldn't do anything right. He is even explicitly blamed for Scarlett Johansson suing Disney, which is a rewrite of history. As was most recently documented by CNBC, and which we covered both at the time and in conjunction with that CNBC expose, see our video on that. It was Bob Iger personally who was 100% responsible for that lawsuit, and he may even have pushed for it as a means to undermine Chapek. That is now a matter of public record, with receipts, something this MCU book does not produce, and it can't, because it's pushing a number of falsehoods. There are more examples of this book blaming Chapek for what the receipts actually make clear that it was Iger that did, but the writers did not look at those receipts, nor did they mention that Disney's highest ever share price happened on Chapek's watch, as that wouldn't fit their narrative of Chapek being a pencil pusher who couldn't do anything right. That's manipulation right there, and the book is rife with more examples of hearsay being presented as facts while actual facts are selectively withheld. But I said there were two ways this book is trying to manipulate you. Let's explore the other. Causality is influenced by which one event, a cause, contributes to the production of another event, the effect. Or put in simpler terms, if you know what order events happened in, you can clearly see what caused which effects. This is why investigators trying to solve a crime or an accident always begin with trying to establish the timeline of events. because once they have a clear timeline, the rest of the puzzle will be much easier to put in place. This is also why any documentary and any book that is trying to make you genuinely understand something virtually always will go through events in the chronological order in which they happened, preserving the timeline, thus enhancing your understanding. The only exception is whenever a new person or other entity enters the story. Then the main narrative will pause while you're taken on a sidetrack back to the past, learning about this new entity from its beginning up until you catch up with where you were in the main narrative. And then the main narrative resumes from there in chronological order. That's generally the way to foster genuine understanding, and that is what most non-fiction books do. Not this one though. The book begins with a mostly chronological retelling of the history of Marvel, as you'd rightfully expect. But before long, the clear and chronological retelling is disrupted by these wild extended sidetracks, not just into the past, but into the future. As an example, the book will have told the story up to the making of Iron Man in a mostly clear, linear chronological fashion. But then suddenly, it will go on this extended sidetrack about casting, where it will suddenly jump years into the future, up to the casting of Guardians of the Galaxy and even Black Panther, then jump back in time to the casting of pre-MCU movies, until several pages later, the narrative suddenly returns to Iron Man, in the vicinity of where you left off. As the chronological retelling continues through Phase 1, 2, and 3, there are more and more of these extended future sidetracks, and increasingly, the narrative doesn't return to where you left off in the main chronological retelling, but at a later point in it. That is, until you reach the end of Phase 3. That's where it should get interesting, as now we've reached a point in the timeline where the fall of Marvel begins. But alas, this is where any semblance of chronological retelling of events simply ends. From where they should have started exploring what went wrong with Phase 4, we simply get random zigzagging back and forth in the timeline, covering only loosely connected events and completely out of order for the rest of the book. It reminded me a bit of Loki on Disney+. If it sounds confusing, it is because it is. The last third of the book is just a jumbled mess. If you were trying to keep a track of what happened when, using only this book as your reference, you'd get a whiplash, and that is obviously by design. I mean, either the editor and all the writers are blatantly incompetent and not fit to write the book, or they are deliberately trying to manipulate you by obfuscating the timeline and which events happened in which order. Because if you, as a reader, were to recognize the actual order of events, you'd see that the author's editorial opinion of what went wrong with Marvel is patently bullshit and will not stand up to scrutiny. Of course, this is where some of you may interject. Yes, the narrative in the book is jumbled to confusion, but there is a clear and printed timeline in the beginning of the book, so what are you on about? To which I say, yes, there is a timeline there, but the one critical event which I submit the narrative of the book is trying to obfuscate is even rewritten and downplayed in this very timeline. More on that when we get to the fall of Marvel. But before we get into where this book drops the ball, let's explore what it actually got right, namely the rise of Marvel and the MCU. Up until this point, all I've done is go through how this book is selective in which information it presents and how it obfuscates the timeline of events, presumably in order to preserve a desired narrative. You know, kind of like Kang created the TVA to prune away all the other timelines that didn't benefit him. Now that we are aware that a narrative is being pushed, let's explore what the book actually has to say. The best part of it are honestly the first few chapters, in which they go through the corporate history that led up to the MCU being created in the first place. Here, there is no need to obfuscate anything, so this is told in a mostly clear, linear, chronological fashion. And here, there were things I didn't even know. The prehistory of the modern Marvel and the MCU with it begins for real when Toy Biz, the company of Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad, took over the by then bankrupt and mismanaged Marvel. And that was no small feat or simple monetary transaction. This story alone is a Ford versus Ferrari event Oscar-winning feature waiting to happen. The gist of it though is that Toy Biz took over Marvel against all odds and against much higher bids, because nobody else on the planet had the vision for Marvel that Perlmutter and Arad had between them, or the unique skill set to realize it, or the sheer tenacity to fight and win against all odds. The unique combination of their skill sets and the sheer force of their personalities, Perlmutter's even more so than Arad's, was instrumental in them not only getting control over Marvel, but in turning it around. Ike Perlmutter was the genius businessman whose origin story reads a little bit like that of Uncle Scrooge, while Avi Arad was the visionary marketer who understood the market and specialized in toys. But due to his understanding of the market, he probably could have been equally successful in any field. I have been guilty of dismissing Arad's contributions myself, and I'm certainly not defending all of his choices as a movie producer, far from it. But the reality is that without the combination of him and Perlmutter, there would be no MCU. Hell, none of the Marvel movies since X-Men onwards would have happened were it not for the two of them together. However much they may have been maligned since, the fact of the matter is that where all Marvel movies of the past 20 plus years are concerned, Perlmutter and Arad are the giants on whose shoulders everyone else has been standing. The business miracles performed by Ike Perlmutter is what enabled Avi Arad to realize the strategy of licensing Marvel properties to film studios, which gave Marvel risk-free millions in licensing revenue while collecting many more millions from toy sales. Because Arad's main contribution to the licensed movies was ensuring they were toyetic, so the toys would fly off the shelves because that's where the real money were. It was an insanely successful business model and risk-free for Marvel because the studios like Fox or Sony paid the movie, so Marvel stood to earn their millions even if the movie flopped. But the flip side of that was that the studio stood to earn hundreds of millions on a successful movie, while Marvel only got tens of millions. That was nonetheless a state of affairs that Arad was very happy with and saw no reason to change. But David Mizell, a former CIA agent with a network and skill set that neither Arad nor Perlmutter had, convinced Perlmutter that if Marvel were to cut out the middleman and become a fully fledged studio in its own right, then all those hundreds of millions would go to Marvel. Now, setting up a fully fledged and externally funded studio was beyond what Perlmutter or Arad could do, but Mizell had the know-how to make that happen. Perlmutter hired him, but since that meant ending Arad's strategy, that's when Arad left Marvel and continued producing the Spider-Man movies for Sony that he was contractually locked in for. Mizell continued where Arad had left off at Marvel though, and established Marvel Studios. But to be clear, Mizell was only able to do that with the help of Ike Perlmutter, building on what Perlmutter had already started with Avi Arad. Thus, it was the combined contributions of Ike Perlmutter, Avi Arad, and David Mizell that created Marvel Studios, and with it, the MCU. Now you may wonder, what about Kevin Feige? Kevin Feige was along for the ride, but the fact of the matter is that he had jack shit to do with any of this. He was a lowly runner working for Lauren Schuler Donner, initially for free, a dreamer with exactly zero accomplishments to his name, and I mean that literally. Where the book breezes through Perlmutter and Arad becoming self-made millionaires and empire builders before even meeting for the first time. The only way it can build up Feige is with extended and romanticized sequences of him sitting in his childhood room, looking at the movie posters on the wall and dreaming of how he could have made them better. But he was good at getting Lauren Schuler-Donner her coffee and whatever else she needed done, so he worked his way up to being her representative on the X-Men, which was produced by her company for Fox. That's where Feige had the good fortune to meet and impress Avi Arad with his work ethic and knowledge of Marvel Comics and his commitment to seeing them done right. And so, Avi Arad hired Feige to help him out on more of his Marvel movies. Make no mistake about it though, if it weren't for Avi Arad hiring him, and by extension for Ike Perlmutter, as there would be no X-Men movie without him, chances are you would never have heard about Kevin Feige. He'd be just another of the thousands of obscure low-level producers whose name you see in movie credits but don't recognize. Feige did demonstrate his worth under the leadership of Avi Arad though, and when David Maisel and Perlmutter assembled Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige was entrusted with the position of President of Production. Though, as the book reveals, Perlmutter had a more experienced backup lined up in case Feige couldn't hack his increased responsibilities. So with or without Kevin Feige, there would have been an MCU. Luckily for Feige though, he did hack it, so with him it was. There is one more key character in the rise of the MCU though. For their first movie, which had to be a hit right out the gate in order to pay off some very expensive loans upon which Marvel Studios was contingent, Jon Favreau was chosen to direct Iron Man. Favreau championed the hiring of Robert Downey Jr., which Perlmutter initially resisted, but he gave in when Favreau leaked that Downey Jr. was in the running to the press and could demonstrate the hype and interest it generated. The movie was filmed without a complete script, but amidst all the improv and day-to-day changes, Favreau was nonetheless able to conjure up a modern-day masterpiece and an instant hit, which not only helped Marvel Studios pay off a big chunk of its debt, it set the tone and stage for the rest of the MCU, which from Iron Man to the Avengers grew from relative obscure characters to the biggest entertainment franchise on Earth. And the first Avengers movie was still just the beginning of their rise, as the MCU kept going from strength to strength, to where nearly all their movies became billion-dollar hits. And then, at some point, it all collapsed, as Marvel began systematically dismantling their own success. Now, as even Variety has decreed, Marvel is a company in crisis. Why? How did that happen? As I broke down earlier in the video, this book is perfectly straightforward about Marvel and the MCU's rise, but it gets nebulous about the fall, and deliberately obfuscates the true reasons behind it. The book seemingly wants you to conclude that Marvel's undisputed contraction was exclusively down to Bob Chapek being a pencil pusher who didn't know what he was doing, and to COVID. But clearly that's not what happened. So what really happened?
Any diverse woman in it, make it gay!
But Mrs. Kennedy, Bambi's a baby deer!
Fuck baby deer, put a chick in it, make her gay!
Okay, I'll put it another way. What could possibly have happened that led to the MCU being Kathleen Kennedy-fied? Well, the answer to that is actually in the book. But they've gone out of their way to hide it, even to the point of leaving something major out of the timeline which is printed in the beginning of it. Exactly what, I will break down in detail in part 2, where we'll explore the fall of Marvel and the MCU. For now though, were you surprised that Kevin Feige had so little to do with the rise of Marvel and the MCU? Don't worry though, he plays a much bigger role in part 2. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and before you go, remember that Midnight's Edge viewers get 30% off the unlimited access plan using our link ground.news/midnights found in the description. By doing so, you're supporting us as well as getting a great product for reliable sources.